you, Irene. This is a tough act to follow, right? So if I could sing, I would, but I can't. So I am a director of the National Australia Bank, which on the previous lists ranks in the top 10 both for the number of female directors and also for the number of female executives. In fact, it's the only company on that list that ranks in the top 10 for both. And so, but it has taken time. And so I just want to say to you that change needs to be intentional or it is too slow. If it's not intentional, if it's not planned for, if it's not part of the DNA of your organisation, if diversity and recognition of the skills that come to boards and executives from diversity is not recognised, it takes forever to get that sort of change. So intentionality is a strategy. It's not something you do just because it's, today we feel like doing it. Hence my earlier question to the CEOs who are here. The second thing I'd say to you is it's an active strategy, not a passive one. Sometimes setting targets is a passive strategy. You set the targets, you come back a year or two later and you go, wow, nothing much has changed. So this does need to be an active strategy, not a passive one, to get into that top 10 list. And the third thing I'd say is that, quite frankly, it needs leadership. It needs leadership at the board level, but it equally needs leadership at the executive level of the organisation. And then the final reason for getting this done faster and sharper across all of our economies is that all of our businesses need the capacity to innovate, to manage risk better, and adapt in a rapidly changing world. And we will never get there if our boards and executive teams look like the boards and executive teams of the 1950s, because that's where your company mindset will end up if that's what it looks like. It needs to change. So, what happened in Australia to make this happen? And to end up with two of those companies there. Woolworths, by the way, has a female CEO as well as a female-dominated board, and it's a very large food retailer. In fact, it's the largest in Australia. What happened, as Irene's already mentioned, is firstly, corporate governance guidelines came from the Australian Stock Exchange more than a decade ago. The Australian Stock Exchange said to all companies listed in Australia, if you want to be a listed company, you need to report on the composition of your board every year to the Stock Exchange, and we will publish it. And we will name and shame all the companies that don't move. And every year, even now, there are a handful of companies, some of them small, some of them in sectors where sometimes there's a strong founder. Those companies every year are named and shamed who have no women on the board. There's only a handful of them left. But also the companies that don't move forward are also named, and you can see performance over time. That has been a very powerful public mechanism because all of those companies have shareholders. All of those companies have investors, and all of those shareholders, which many of you may be in your countries, have the capacity to turn up at an AGM and ask the question directly of their board about why they haven't changed the composition, the gender composition of their board. That was the first thing. The second thing that changed is investor voices have changed over time. Irene gave the examples of the pension funds in the US. In Australia, our private capital market, the capital held in superannuation pension funds in Australia, is now as big as our public capital market. $4 trillion are held in superannuation funds in Australia. Those shareholders, the people in those funds, are Australian workers, by and large. And those funds are active investors. And the CEOs of those funds, when it comes to reporting season for companies in Australia, ask questions publicly and through media about the composition of boards, whether those boards that don't have enough diversity are fit for purpose in the 21st century. whether those boards have the capability to meet the demands of that business, whether those boards can risk management when their directors look like the directors of a past era. That has been a very, very powerful change mechanism in our market. The third thing that's changed, and this goes to the executive ranks, is that all of the executives in all of the companies actually that I'm on, where I'm on the board, have targets that are set for diversity in their businesses, and those targets have financial incentives. And so you feel the pain if you don't achieve your targets. And they're not small amounts in their incentives, they're larger amounts in their incentives. And there's nothing quite like a motivation of a target with money attached. Because also if you don't attach positive and negative incentives, then it's just another set of words. It's another thing in the list of incentives in the organisation. The fourth thing is that for all of us as directors, as company directors, and all of you in the room, we are actually charged with making sure our companies deliver good returns, better returns, are charged with being ready for the changing world, as we saw earlier with demographics and AI, are charged with making sure our companies can deliver the performance that we promise the market. And we know that that happens when you have diverse teams. If your executive team, again, looks like an executive team of a bygone era, your chances of delivering or outperforming are very low. And so as company directors, we have a collective responsibility, whether you're a male or female director, to make sure that happens. And then finally, in our world, government comes down the list a bit further. And so government in Australia has not driven the change in the private sector. The stock exchange led and drove a lot of that. But government does drive change in its own boards, and all governments, state and federal governments in Australia, now require the boards that they appoint to be gender balanced. And most recently, that has extended into the boards of sporting organisations. So pay attention, everyone, to this one. Where do you think power sits now in many of our countries? It sits on the board of sporting organisations. Where does influence sit? Who wants to go to major sporting events all over the world? Oh, that would be leaders of nations. Men everywhere want to go to sporting events. So if your sports boards don't reflect change, then how on earth can we get change in that area of our community? And in most of our countries, government stumps up plenty of money into sport. And so in Australia, the government has just announced that as it puts funding into sporting organisations right across the country, even those that are quite well supported by sponsors and others, that every sporting organisation in Australia needs to have gender balance on its board. Everyone. And as we're going to be the host of the 2032 Olympics, that's actually going to be true of all the Olympic organising events as well. Everything that touches sport in Australia, by the time the Olympics arrive in 2032, will be gender balanced. Irene also mentioned Champions of Change, which began as male Champions of Change, in fact, because all the CEOs were men. It's now being called the Champions of Change Coalition, because that first generation of men who were members of that group committed publicly to reporting every year on the change that was being made through their organisations. And many of them were not listed companies, so they weren't required through the listing rules to do it at the stock exchange. But the next generation of CEOs, in a very substantial proportion of those companies, are women. And so that organisation has continued, but it is now a coalition of male and female champions of change who, inside their organisations, chase down the cultural pockets where things aren't really moving, chase down the parts of their organisation where women aren't flourishing, chase down the recruitment of graduates and their support into universities to make sure that they've got women coming into their organisations at equal numbers of men and women. So that part of our change process actually is driven by the CEOs of those companies and is also publicly reported on. Shining a light on the things that work and don't work, the organisations that have driven change and haven't driven change, is a really powerful mechanism. People, companies, CEOs, boards do not like being in the public for the things that they don't want to be recognised for. That is, failure to address change in their organisations. And that tool is probably available to all of us in our own markets to highlight the companies that do well, but also to name the companies who do not do well. And now in our market in Australia, our next frontier is to make sure not only have we got gender equality, but we also have the cultural diversity on our boards that reflects the multicultural nature of our community. And that's the next phase of change. Thank you.